Welcome to another episode of The Heart of the Matter. Today we have Titilope Sonuga, who is a poet, a spoken word poet, with us. And we're talking generally about how to become a poet. So Titilope, you're welcome to The Heart of the Matter.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
It's not something that many Nigerians do. So how was your journey to becoming a poet? Because, you know, as you said already, you actually started in engineering.
I did.
So what was the journey like?
It couldn't be further apart. I was born and raised here in Lagos. When I was about 13 years old, my family left Nigeria and moved to Canada. And in that time, I know that I wrote poetry, but in a very casual way, and I liked writing stories, and I did that for fun. I studied in Canada, went to university, studied civil engineering, and poetry was sort of in the back of my mind, but it wasn't something I had thought was possible to make a life or career out of. It wasn't something I even recognized as a calling, perhaps. I just thought it was this thing that I liked to do. But I still found opportunities to, you know, share my poetry and write while I was doing my engineering. So I graduated and started working. I worked for 5 years as a civil engineer, building roads outdoors, designing roads. And through it all, I was always, you know, in my truck, you know, scribbling something on a page or teaching a workshop in a school, performing. And so poetry sort of, I have this belief about when you are sort of called to do something, it has a way of eclipsing the rest of your life. So poetry started to take over in ways that I hadn't expected, and one opportunity would lead to another opportunity, to another opportunity. And it became very clear, both to me and the people around me, that there was something there to explore. When I first decided to take on poetry as a full-time career, I just thought 6 months, you know, see what you can make happen in that time. And 6 months turned into a year, and here we are.
Now, to the unenlightened mind like mine, poetry is, you know, rhyming. What exactly is poetry?
That's a very big question. I mean, poetry varies. There are different styles of poetry, but I think ultimately what poetry serves to do is to articulate the human experience in the most true and concise way possible. And so sometimes that's in a rhyme, sometimes it's in a free verse, sometimes it's on the page, sometimes it's in your voice. And so I think it varies depending on who's doing the creating.
Because it could just be a letter.
It could.
And could you call it a poem? If
it depends.
Okay.
Yes.
I'm still trying to understand. So you made a career out of it.
I did.
So how has that been? How, you know, you said you tried for 6 months, it turned into a year. How has it been making a career out of poetry?
It's been an interesting journey. Part of that career started in Canada. And so my experience in the Canadian scene is very different from my experience here in Nigeria. And several opportunities have come up since I started. So one of the great things that happened while I was in Canada was the opportunity to perform at the Achebe Colloquium for Africa at Brown University at the time. So I had the opportunity to meet Achebe and to perform with some incredible poets. I had an opportunity to also meet Maya Angelou before she passed away because of poetry and because I decided to write. Being in Nigeria has been interesting in that the spoken word scene is very newish. And it's growing. People are starting to get a deeper understanding of the profession as more than just this funny thing that the kids are doing. So you'll find more and more, rap poetry, as they like to call it. More and more events will say, okay, before we start our event, maybe we'll have a poet come and open with a word about something, either something specific to their show or something else. And I think that's evolved over time, because I remember in the beginning, poetry or spoken word was a thing where they would just put you, there's a band playing, they just say, I just go up there and just say something. And it was, you were sort of a stepchild, you know, in the process. But now you see poets taking center stage. And so it's exciting to be, you know, sort of in the mix of that movement. And it's been quite rewarding, so no complaints. Okay,
so now you did a poem for the inauguration of the Nigerian president last year.
In 2015.
How did that go? Do you remember the poem?
I do very vaguely, because I've performed it for that event, and I don't think ever since. And it was filled with such nerves.
But you keep a record of all your
of course. So all of my poems start on the page first. So I write them first, and then I memorize them and perform them. Some people don't even go to the page at all. They just know it in their heads. So everything starts on the page. So I have obviously a record of all the things I've written. It was interesting. It was obviously a massive stage, and both the massive physical stage, but also, you know, it went across the world. And so you recognize that it's a big moment and you want to say something that matters. So I think I did okay. You know, it was nice.
I must see if I can find it in the archives.
The video, yes, yes.
Now, getting a poem done, what's the process for you? I mean, I expect if you're going to write a book, if you're going to write a song, you need inspiration. Some people, for inspiration, have to go apart from everybody else. What's your process?
It varies. So sometimes I'm writing a poem because somebody has specifically said, we're doing an event for, you know, young girls, women's empowerment, and we want you to say something. So you've already started the poem with a theme in mind, and you're writing based on that. Like with anything else, a quiet space and pen and paper, or I type quicker than I write, so actually everything I write on a laptop, which is very different from the traditional way of writing pen and paper. But sometimes a poem is just inspired and is a gift from above, so to speak. It just, a line of a word, or a line comes to mind, you write it down, and sometimes it sits on the page there for weeks at a time, and then you're chewing on it for a while and trying to understand what it is that needs to be said, what you're trying to say, and then you come back to it, you put a little bit down at a time. A poem can take a week, it can take 30 seconds, you know, it varies. But
so what sort of notice would you like if somebody wanted to write something?
It's strange, you know, I've written poems in 15 minutes and I've taken 2 weeks to write poems. I guess it depends on if I really care about what it is that you want me to say. Typically, if it's something that I can connect to, it's very easy for me to make something happen.
Okay, let me then ask you this question. What are the things that you can easily connect to?
What can I connect to? Things that are true, things that have a deeper purpose, things that serve to inspire and uplift, things that that care, things that are rooted in something that is not frivolous or superficial. Women, girls, people who are downtrodden and people who are often forgotten or left behind. Those kind of things inspire me. And ultimately, knowing that whatever it is that I'm saying, when I say it, it has a deeper purpose for somebody else. That's important to me.
Well, we're going to be back in a minute because we need to go on a break. Viewers, stay tuned to The Heart of the Matter. We'll be back in a moment.
So this is a poem for the women. When the world unravels before you, when even your dreams are crumbling stones, when everything you dare to touch is set on fire and all around you is ash and smoke, remember this: rock bottom is a perfect place for rebuilding. Remember that you are your mother's daughter, your grandmother's answered prayer, a whole bloodline of women who bend in response to raging winds. There's nothing broken here, nothing damaged or discarded. Each scar is a badge of honor, every misstep a victory dance waiting to happen. You are a woman becoming, learning the complicated language of forgiveness, the intricate lessons of the universe. Your heart is just a muscle, and it needs exercise. You were born for this sort of heavy lifting. You were born one part saint, one part warrior woman. Loving yourself without shame is the most important thing you'll ever have to fight for.
Welcome back to The Heart of Matter, where we're talking to Titilope Sonuga. She's a spoken word poet, and we're just trying to find out a bit more about poetry and about her. So just coming back to what we're talking about before the break. You get inspiration. Yes. You write a poem, and it's usually something that means a lot to you, inspires you more than something that you don't really care that much about. Now, there are lots of people watching this program today who are probably still very young and tender, and they would want to understand a bit more about poetry. How can they become a poet like you? What are the kind of things that they should watch? They're still in school, so what subjects should they kind of major on and so on?
I mean, it's, there's no real prescription per se, but I would say one of the things that I know was at the backbone of the reason why I do what I do is that I read a lot as a child. My dad was not very big on reading, so he would buy us books, and it wasn't always, you don't have to read poetry to be inspired. I read novels, I read anything I could get my hands on. I was reading books all the time. And so
like, how many books were you reading every week?
If it was the summertime, you could blow through quite a few books. I have 4 sisters, so he would just bring a pile, and you would pick and you would read. So, you know, a book in a week or 2, and you move on to the next book until you're done.
What sort of books were you reading? Fiction?
A lot of fiction, but I would say we weren't necessarily restricted to cartoons or comic books, but we obviously everybody will say we read Chinua Achebe, because how could you grow up in Nigeria and not read? So books that felt close to home, so a lot of books by African writers, but also books that were from outside of the country. And so even by the time we moved to Canada, I was reading everything. I was reading Maya Angelou, I was reading Sonia Sanchez, other female poets as well, whose experiences were very different from mine, but I was learning a thing about craft. So reading the books were not necessarily reading them because they spoke directly to my experience, but you're learning the way in which people tell their stories, and that inspires your work. Read and write and practice. In the practicing, the first poem is not going to be great. But in the practicing and the more reading, and we live in a digital age now, so if you go on YouTube, for example, you see poets performing their work, you can hear them, and so you take the experience off the page as well, and you start to slowly grow your voice, and that's the way.
You made a very important point here, that the first poem is not necessarily going to be it.
It doesn't have to be.
Okay. Now, what should our viewers do if they want to go into poetry and they get discouraged? What was your process that can help them, you know, deal with the fact that it's not going to happen overnight?
A lot of patience. One of the things that I try to be a student of the craft, so simply feeling like you're inspired isn't always enough. So going for workshops and learning from other poets. You can go online, you don't even need to sit in front of a poet, you can go online now and search for poetry exercises, and in the same way that you work through a math problem so that you get better at math, you can do that with poetry as well. So do different exercises. There's a poetry festival that happens here in Lagos every year, the Lagos International Poetry Festival. Come out to those events, you can meet poets one-on-one, learn from them, listen to them, and just keep practicing. And there's no microwave solution. It's time and patience and just really trying to get better, genuinely better. Listen to feedback. If somebody says this thing is not good, you know, kind of have a look and see what can be better, and keep practicing.
Now, you mentioned in the list of poets that you'd met, you mentioned a number of people, but you didn't mention Wale Adefarasin.
Yes.
Have you met him?
I have.
And how inspirational has his work been?
I mean, I think they're a crop of writers who we look at and think, you know, if I were to do any work that scratched the surface of what they managed to do, then I would have done okay in my life. Wale Adefarasin is one of those people. There was an event called Wale Adefarasin at 80 that happened a year or so ago, and they invited 80 poets to come and perform, and it was a great honor. And so for me, people like Wale Adefarasin, people like Chinua Achebe, people like Chimamanda Adichie remind you that everybody has a story to tell, and telling your own story.
Is Chimamanda Adichie a poet? Would you?
She's a writer.
Yeah.
I wouldn't necessarily call her a poet, but there's something poetic in the way that she writes. And like I was saying earlier about how sometimes your inspiration doesn't come from poetry alone. Sometimes I'll hear a song or read a book, and suddenly there's something in there that inspires a poem. And so the range of things that I listen to or watch that inspire me, they're varied. So from poets to actors to music to film, you know, those sort of things. But, you know, they remind you that there are stories to tell, and everybody has the room to tell their own authentic stories, and that's important.
Now, you are a spoken word poet.
Yes.
That doesn't mean that you don't write poetry. In fact, as you said, it starts on the page first. But what is it about spoken word
I had the opportunity of going, I was in Berlin this last week for the Berlin Poetry Festival, and also invited was Professor Neo Shundare, who's a legendary poet. And he had said in conversation that there's something in the spoken word, there's a power in the spoken word that the written word cannot contain. And the reason why I gravitate towards spoken word is because in the beginning was the word. There's something about saying a word out loud that draws a certain kind of power. You can read a poem on the page, you can feel a poem on the page, but there's a magic to me in the spoken word, and there's something deeper that you can convey when you say it out loud.
Okay, so now you do a lot of traveling for poetry, and I was going to ask, do some of your poems rhyme? What's it generally?
I cannot write a rhyming poem to save my life. Okay. I think I work best in sort of free verse. The poems will generally have a theme that carries through from beginning to end, but I find it easier to convey a message outside of a rhyme. Some people do it brilliantly. I just recognize that's not my gift.
We're going to take a break now, okay. But I don't know if you've got any poems in your head that you can just do for us when we come back from the break.
Sure.
Thanks. Viewers, stay tuned. We'll be back in a moment to continue with Titilope Sonuga.
Snap the branches of our family trees to fit in the overhead compartment. So close to heaven we could whisper our secrets to the clouds. Sit in conversation with the angels about new beginnings. We ran across borders, across bloodlines, across battlefields. We waited in embassies and airports and refugee camps. We sat on buses, on trains, on airplanes. From across the world we came, clutching all of our best intentions, braided it into our hair, tucked beneath our hijabs and turbans. We curled our tongues around a new language, found a brand new word for home.
Welcome back to the Heart of the Matter, where we're talking with Titilope Sonuga. Just before the break, you promised that you will do us a poem. So we're just going to move out of the way for you. And you said it's My Mother's Music.
My Mother's Music.
So, viewers, My Mother's Music, Titi Sonuga.
My mother sang when I was born. She welcomed me headfirst into melody. She chanted like a talking drum. She caught God's spell in gospel. And then she named me Titilope, an eternal love song to her creator. She was the improvisation of jazz. She would speak easy when I cried, sing her soul music. Rocking and rolling me in her arms, she would dance, and I found peace there. Eyes closed, listening to the rhythm and blues of my mother's love. And she was the coolness of hip-hop, but her anger was rock and roll, and every time I strayed, she would strike the right chords to remind me that I was a reflection of God, just like her, and therefore I mirror image of her. And so I learned to understand the complex grooves of her funk. See, every bit of history I needed to know, I learned in my mother's music. It was there that I learned the sounds of joy and pain, love and heartbreak over rippling riffs and drum beats, and through it all, the clearest music that I would know was that insistent beat behind my mother's chest, and I found peace there, eyes closed, listening to the rhythm and blues of my mother's love. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I understand spoken word poetry a lot better.
Yeah.
Now, you've also done some other works, Icarus. Tell us a little bit about that.
I wrote Icarus after the Dana Airlines plane crash. I lost a family friend in that crash, and it seemed as though everybody knew somebody, yeah, or more than one person in many cases. And the poem came out of a frustration for the way in which things happen. We suffer and smile through it, and then we move on very quickly to the next tragedy. And I guess sometimes as a poet, you feel as though you can't physically do anything, but you have something to say. And so I wrote Dana I wrote Icarus after the Dana Airlines crash, but also I wrote it about what it means. It's about, it takes after the myth, the Icarus myth, about this boy who took his father's wings, wanted to fly, flew too close to the sun, his wings got burnt and he crashed, which was a very literal metaphor for the crash, but also a metaphor for the way in which we move in the country and how we seem to sometimes want to bite off more than we can chew, and when the tragedy happens, we forget, we move on to the next thing, and life goes on, business as usual. Meanwhile, there are people whose lives will never be the same again, and so sometimes when you don't know the name of the person who was involved, which doesn't, it's not your business, but when you give people names, when you say such and such's daughter, such and such's wife, there was a wedding, they're real human beings, suddenly you're forced to pay attention.
Now, listening to you talk about Icarus, I can see some threads of politics.
Absolutely.
So have you written anything political?
I think everything is political. I think, existing, living, being alive in Nigeria is political, and having something to say is political. I don't wake up and decide I'm going to write a political piece, but by virtue of the way we live our lives, the issues that we are confronted with on a daily basis, it's very difficult to write a poem about your experience living and working in Nigeria and it not have a sort of political undertone because, let's face it, things are rough.
Now, you said that your experience in Canada is very different from your experience in Nigeria. Mm-hmm. So you've been back in Nigeria, you've been doing, I don't want to say your trade, but,
mm-hmm.
That's what it is. In Nigeria, what are the experiences that, have shaped your poetry having come back to Nigeria?
It's very, Icarus was written while I was in Canada. So there's a way that you write poetry about being Nigerian or African and that experience from afar that feels very distant. So you're talking at something. Living in Lagos, when I'm talking about, fuel scarcity, I know physically what that feels like. When you're talking about, a car crash or something that you saw on the road, it's not a distant memory. You're calling it from the present. There's something about the work that becomes more honest, more authentic, more real when you are living it versus reminiscing about it. And so living here has made me more compassionate and empathetic, recognizing that things are not black and white. And so there are layers and textures to different things. And so it affects the way that I write poetry and the things that I even choose or want to write about.
Any no-go areas?
No-go areas.
That you will not write anything
that I will not write anything about. I just choose not to write things that are derogatory, things that bring people down, things that don't add value. There's no point.
Okay. Now, finally, because we're running out of time,
mm-hmm.
What's the favorite poem that you have written?
Ooh. There's a poem called Becoming. It's not a political poem at all. It's a poem about becoming a woman, actually. Okay. And it's a poem that I loved for myself, but also once I put it out there, people seem to gravitate towards because it's about the very complex journey to becoming a woman and how you have to learn about forgiveness and starting over and the painful growth of going from girl to woman. And it's a poem that I reach for in tough times, and it's a poem that other people have reached out to me and said, I heard this poem, I was going through such and such.
It's called Becoming.
Becoming.
Okay.
Becoming.
Now, what is your favorite all-time poem, not necessarily written by yourself?
Ooh, that's a very tough question. There are too many. There's a poet that I love whose name is Worcestershire, and she wrote a poem called For Women Who Are Difficult to Love. It's a poem that it's a similar poem to Becoming in that it's about this experience of becoming a woman and accepting yourself for who you are. She's a young poet, actually. You would imagine that I would say, a Maya Angelou or somebody, but there are a lot of contemporary poets who are writing things that are really powerful, and Warson is one of those people, so it's a poem that I love.
Okay. And just finally, if somebody wants to watch you, can I use the word perform?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Where do they go? Do they go to YouTube?
Yes. So,
and do you have performances? Do you, for instance, go to DD Museum or something like that?
Right. There's several ways. So you can connect with me on the internet. I have a website, www.titilope.ca, On there, there are audio...
.ca.
.ca,
Okay, that's
Canada.
Canada.
There are audio versions of the poems, there are links to YouTube videos, performances of the poems. But there are venues all over Lagos where you might catch me performing. Thursday nights at Bugabiri, there's an open mic that I sometimes perform at. I have a show that happens...
Bugabiri is the...
it's a restaurant slash boutique
yeah.
hotel.
I think we've had Bugabiri, the guy.
Oh,
here
right,
at
okay.
some point.
And then close to the end of the year, in October and November, I have a show called Becoming. And it's an all-women spoken word music show that is also great. So please come out to that. Okay. I'm everywhere.
If anybody wants to get in touch with you, say they want to go into poetry or what have you, you have an email address that they can have. We can put it on the screen.
Sure.
At the end of the...
Yeah, it's info@titilope.ca. If you go to titilope.ca, there's a page there. You can send me a message. I'll respond right away. I'm also on Twitter @DearTitilope. I'm all over the internet, so just look me up.
It's been great having you on the Heart of the Matter. We really appreciate it. Now, I am educated.
Thank you so much.
So thanks so much for coming.
Thank you.
Viewers, it's been our pleasure to present this episode to you. We'll be back again next week with another episode. Until then, stay blessed.